few years ago, a group of my friends were all using Rent the Runway to get designer dresses for this fancy gala that we were all going to. But I just couldn't, because all I could think of was the short story The White Satin Evening Gown. This short story is another Alvin Schwartz nightmare creation. That man is the source of so many of my unresolved childhood anxieties. He's the author of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark and In a Dark, Dark Room and Other Scary Stories. I've talked about his children's short story, The Green Ribbon, in a previous video. I'm an adult now with like a mortgage and a job, and I can barely bring myself to look at these book covers. Especially this weird clown skull tree thing. How did somebody think of that? And why? It was also weird for me to learn that Alvin Schwartz died in 1992. So it's possible that he died before I ever even read one of his stories. And now his words are haunting me. The White Satin Evening Gown is a tale from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. It's about a young woman who wants a boyfriend, but she is very poor, and she gets invited to a fancy party, so she rents a dress, and she goes to the party, and she has a great time, but she dies because the dress was poisoned because it was stolen from a corpse. It has a surprising amount in common with the death of Hercules. Yes, the Greek hero Hercules. So I would like to talk about this story and then a little bit about the history of poisoned dresses just in general. The actual story of the White Satin Evening Gown is surprisingly short. So I can read it briefly to you now so we are all on the same page, pun intended. A young man invited a young woman to a formal dance. But she was very poor, and she could not afford to buy the evening gown she needed for such an occasion. "Maybe you can rent a dress," her mother said. So she went to a pawn shop not far from where she lived. There she found a white satin evening gown in her size. She looked lovely in it, and she was able to rent it for very little. When she arrived at the dance with her friend, she was so attractive, everyone wanted to meet her. She danced again and was having a wonderful time. But then she began to feel dizzy and faint, and she asked her friend to take her home. "I think I have danced too much," she told him. When she got home, she lay down on her bed. The next morning, her mother found that her daughter had died. The doctor did not understand what had caused her death, so he had the coroner perform an autopsy. The coroner found that she had been poisoned by embalming fluid. It had stopped her blood from flowing. There were traces of the fluid on her dress. I'm not going to make a Monica Lewinsky joke. He decided it had entered her skin when she perspired while she was dancing. The pawnbroker said he bought the dress from an undertaker's helper. It had been used in a funeral for another young woman, and the helper had stolen it just before she was buried. The end. In my memory, the story was much longer. And it's written in such a simplistic, straightforward way that when I pulled up the text online, I initially thought I had just found a summary, but nope, that's the entire thing. While this story is less visceral than The Green Ribbon, I think the most haunting element is the fact that there's nothing supernatural about it. The girl didn't die from an old curse or a vengeful spirit. She died because of human greed and negligence, which are very, very real. I remember reading this story for the first time at a sleepover, and I was horrified. So of course I read it out loud for everybody else, because middle school girls will try to traumatize each other for life in a variety of ways. Considering that The Green Ribbon is based on a Washington Irving retelling of a French legend, I had thought that maybe the White Satin Evening Gown had a similar source of inspiration. The idea of a poisoned dress that was taken from a corpse and inadvertently kills someone is something of an urban legend, but there is no clear, singular origin story. I checked. However, in the 1700s, there were actual unintentionally poisoned dresses. At that time, a new type of emerald green fabric dye was all the rage among fashionable ladies. This green dye was to die for. But the green color was so beautiful because it was actually made with arsenic. And I couldn't find any verifiable accounts of women actually dying from wearing an arsenic dress, but there are a number of stories floating around of women wearing arsenic clothing, specifically gloves, and getting a little bit sweaty, and then getting horrible sores and scabs from the fabric. There are a lot of pictures online that are associated with arsenic dresses, some of which I used in this video, but I can't confirm that a lot of them are actual, authentic, tested arsenic dresses, except for one. So here's a picture from the Oshawa Museum's blog of an actual dress that they have on display that tested positive for arsenic. Thank you to the intern that posted this. However, while it's possible that nobody died from an arsenic dress, there is a very well-known incident regarding Matilda Scherer, an attractive 19-year-old woman who worked in a factory where she coated artificial flowers in arsenic. In 1861, Matilda died a very gruesome death. She suddenly started vomiting green, the whites of her eyes turned green, her fingertips turned green, and as she was dying, she told the doctors that everything she could see was green. A doctor performed an autopsy on her later and found arsenic poisoning in many of her internal organs. I think even her bile was green. Sorry if that's gross. But while she wasn't poisoned by an arsenic dress, her death and the arsenic-dyed fabrics does bear a certain similarity to the white satin evening gown. The general literary notion of poisoned clothing apparently goes way back, just all the way back to ancient Greece. And I didn't know this until recently, but apparently Hercules, the half-human son of Zeus, died because of a poisoned tunic. To give you a very loose retelling, Hercules' second wife needed to cross a river, and a centaur named Nessus was giving her a ride, but midway across the river, for some reason the centaur decided, nah, and began to force himself on her. But, Hercules was right there, and so he shot Nessus with an arrow. As Nessus was dying, he told the wife that his blood was actually a powerful love potion that would keep Hercules faithful. So the wife stole the centaur's blood-soaked tunic and hid it away. Later, Hercules went to go do Hercules things, and he found himself a super hot concubine. His wife was, of course, very jealous, so she sent Hercules the tunic to wear. And he put it on, and then being just a very sweaty guy, the centaur's blood began seeping into his skin. Turns out, the centaur's blood was not a love potion, it was actually a very powerful toxin for Hercules, and began to literally flay the flesh from his bones. He realized immediately that something was wrong and he was dying, so he began to rip trees out of the ground and build his own funeral pyre, and he just threw himself on it, all dramatic, except that he didn't have anything to light it with. So he had to beg a bunch of random passersby to light him on fire so he could die, and most of them said no. But finally one of his friends showed up and lit the pyre, and Hercules burned to death. They didn't show us that in the Disney movie. My biggest takeaway from this myth is that apparently the centaur was wearing a shirt. And that directly conflicts with just all of my internal imagery of centaurs. It feels weird that a centaur would be wearing a shirt and no pants. I know the bottom half is a horse, but horse is not the same as pants. Anyway, moral of the story is, trust nothing and always wash your clothes before wearing them. And if you have any lingering anxieties surrounding women's fashion, such as ribbons or used dresses, check to see if you read any Alvin Schwartz stories as a kid.